Hi, I'm Mark Auslander in Anthropology and Cultural Production at Brandeis University. I recently visited the newly reopened National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. I was interested to see the reinstallation of the famous lunch counter from the F.W. Woolworth Company's store on Elm Street in Greensboro, North Carolina. As the text rail explains, on February 1st, 1960, four African American students challenged Jim Crow segregation through a passive sit-down action. They sat down at this counter and tried to order lunch. As is well known in museum circles, this section of the lunch counter was obtained for the museum through the fast-acting efforts of curators William Yangst and Lonnie Bunch, after Yangst learned in 1993 that the Elm Street store was being closed. There's a lovely series of online interviews with Bill Yangst and his colleague Faith Davis Ruffins about the counter at objectsofhistory.org, the museum's educational website. But right now, I'm most interested in the physical installation of the object within the museum. It's a much less elaborate installation than the comparable lunch counter exhibition at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, for instance. That installation features life-size mannequins of seated African American activists and of whites taunting them, next to a video on the student-led sit-in movement. Indeed, the new Smithsonian installation is also a good deal starker than the previous presentations of the same artifact in this same museum. An old installation included the canopy above the counter, which featured ads for banana splits and shortcake and was flanked by panels of text and photographs on the history of the movement in Greensboro. The old installation also had a powerful supertitle prominently displayed, "Sitting for Justice, the Greensboro Sit-In of 1960. But now all these elements have been stripped away, so that it's rather difficult for those viewing the installation at a distance to understand what they are looking at, until they peer at the text rail itself. Nonetheless, there are some highly effective aspects to the new installation. It's positioned beneath the eastern escalators on the first floor, so that it's positioned next to the temporary gallery reserved for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is building a permanent building next door. Equally interesting, it's positioned at the other end of the long corridor from the famous statue of George Washington, seated below the western escalators. Midpoint between George Washington and the lunch counter is the new elaborate installation of the Star-Spangled Banner. So one way of reading the new positioning of the lunch counter is that it highlights the contrast between the initial promise of American democracy, as represented by Washington and the flag, and the long road of struggle required to make that promise good through the modern civil rights movement. It is especially interesting that the seated George Washington at the opposite end of the corridor is prominently reflected in the mirror behind the counter. So an alternate reading of the installation is that George Washington has finally, a little late to be sure, joined in the sit-in, and at long last is enlisted in the struggle to bring about equality to all America's citizens. I'm delighted that the new installation allows space for chairs to be placed in front of the lunch counter on weekends, so that interpreters can lecture to visitors about the civil rights movement, and ask visitors in effect to put themselves in this mirror, reflecting on how they would have acted during the challenges of Jim Crow. Having said all this, the stripped-down lunch counter still retains the flavor of an insurgent initiative, it seems to me, by curators operating within the rather unsympathetic context of the larger Smithsonian bureaucracy. The sparse, minimally funded lunch counter installation stands in striking contrast, for instance, to the extremely elaborate exhibition, "The Price of Freedom, Americans at War," at the top of the escalator. This decidedly right-wing retelling of American history through the prism of military history was funded by the notorious conservative Kenneth Baring, who through his $80 million donation was able to permanently append his name to that of the museum, which is now officially termed the National Museum of American History and Kenneth Baring Center. Thanks to the lamentable administration of former Smithsonian Secretary Lawrence Small, the museum's two most brilliant exhibitions, on the African American Great Migration North and the Japanese American internments during World War II, are now gone from the institution. In that sense, the installation of the lunch counter, in its elegant simplicity, still stands as a poignant, quiet monument to the challenges of telling progressive, inclusive public history at the end of the Bush-Cheney era. What a curious irony that this installation opens on the eve of the inauguration of President Barack Obama on this very same National Mall. Please post a response to this video essay. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks.